afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another edition of The Democratic View. I'm the hostess. My name is Phyllis Italiano. And as usual on this show, we try to talk about some of the issues that are facing our lovely East Hampton town. And what we have today is Rebecca Singer, who is representing a group of people called LIBRA, which means Long Island Businesses for Responsible Energy. I got it right. And Rebecca is going to tell us, starting from the beginning, the interesting story about what has happened in her life. So take it away, Rebecca.
Well, one day I woke up and I looked out the window and I suddenly saw these gigantic poles, one to the left of my home and one to the right of my home. They're about 60 feet. That had not been there before. And we have it's McGurk Street, so it's a very, very narrow street, very picturesque street. And they were utility poles that were going up. And we knew nothing about them, had not heard anything about them. And a day or two later, some people from our street came around and said they were having a meeting in their house about those same utility poles because everyone had done the same thing, looked out their window. And we met on a Sunday, a group of us from the street, and decided that, first of all, we were terrified that the poles would fall down and hit our houses. And we just didn't know where they'd come from, why we hadn't heard about it. And immediately, a couple of people got in touch with the mayor's office. And that week, we met with the mayor's office and representatives from PSEG, who actually were from New Jersey at that time. And it was just supposed to be 2 people from our group and I think a couple of people from PSEG, but about 20 people from our group showed up. And about 20 people from PSEG New Jersey showed up. So obviously, everybody was very prepared to fight it. And basically, we got a lot of double talk at the meeting. First, we were told, we asked why they had run a 6.2-mile route when a direct route was along the railroad 4 miles to Amagansett. They told us they couldn't do it, the railroad wouldn't let them, and then we asked a few more questions, and it ended up they never asked the railroad for permission. And it was just a lot of things like that. And basically what happened is we asked them to stop the work on it so that we could find out more about what was going on. They claimed they had sent notices to all of us, and almost, I think maybe 3 people had gotten notices. Most of us had never heard about it. And then we started meeting with PSEG Long Island, a small group, and they agreed that they would bury the poles, which is what we asked, but they said they would only bury them if we paid for them, and they would not halt the project. So building the project was like a $7 million project, so we would have to pay for that, have the poles removed, and then we would have to pay to bury the project. And so at some point, PSC just stopped coming to the meetings with us, and they said they'd only meet with us if we actually had the money in hand, and that's how they've been ever since, very arrogant. But the town brought a lawsuit against them because of the Amagansett substation, something that they had done wrong, so they had not filed the right paperwork. So because of that, the poles have totally gone up, 267 poles, but they have never been charged. So they're just sitting there uncharged, and the summer has come and gone, and we have not had a blackout, which they said we absolutely would have. In fact, we've gone 2 summers without a blackout with fewer generators.
I have never had a blackout except when there was a storm. And that's the only time the lights in my particular area of Springs have ever been out. We have never had what's called in the city a brownout.
Right.
We never had that
Right.
here.
And 2 years ago, they also removed 2 generators from Montauk. Obviously, they weren't that worried about having a blackout if they removed 2 generators without having another plan in place. And we still don't have those generators replaced. and we don't have these new wires charged, and we've managed just fine. So at this point, based on all we've learned about what LIPA has done, really the question is, was there ever a need for these lines in the first place? And we believe there wasn't a need, that we don't have the need for these to go up, and that there are definitely alternative ways to give us more power and more energy without resorting to these lines.
So backtracking just a bit, I have to always add about McGurk Street, where I don't think two cars can pass each other. It's that narrow. And if you do, you have to do it gingerly.
Yes, you have to do it carefully.
And it also is the Andy Hardy set of East Hampton, because it is so beautiful and so lovely.
Right.
And these poles, which are huge, are some of them maybe 15 feet from the houses.
Right.
And they are supposed to withstand winds of 135 miles. However, in the storm of 38, the winds on the eastern side of the cyclonic thing that happens in hurricanes was 150. So these poles could fall, and if they fall on a house, would crush a house.
Right.
Absolutely crush a house. If they are electrified, which they are not now, there is no electricity as far as we know, running through these poles, through these wires. There are gas lines that run under that street, which would explode, and we would have an unbelievable tragedy, as well as that these poles run right by the emergency center in East Hampton, which really baffles me. Unbelievable that this company has absolutely no knowledge of the town that they are in. And the Amagansett station that you were talking about, they didn't get the work order to really complete this facility, which is like, it was a little thing like this and now becomes a great big thing like this, and pretty ugly, I might add, right by the train station. And we have the town of East Hampton put a stop work order on it, which is now in litigation.
Right.
So
the
that
town
brings us-
has won three of the motions, so we're just waiting. And it's taking a very, very long time, but it's to our advantage at this point.
And the groups that began in the beginning, the group that began, it was one group. I remember the first meeting that we went to.
Right.
Everybody was filled to the brim at the town hall.
Right.
And then you guys went a separate way, which is through litigation.
Right. We felt, based on how LIPA, PSGG were reacting, we did not believe that they were operating in good faith. Unfortunately, we were right, unfortunately. And we also did not believe that we could rely on money from FEMA and other places, and that the only way was to go through the courts. And so that's why we went through litigation. We also did not think that the town and the village were really standing up against the issues. So it really meant that people in the town had to do that.
Also, we had a governor who was completely ignoring
Absolutely.
the pleas of the people in the town,
Right.
and saying, wait a minute, this is a residential area, and what are you doing putting this kind of stuff through in a residential area? And he has had a deaf ear.
Right. But we actually started our litigation, when I think about it, it was already April when we formed late March, April. So we actually were very early into it. And it was before we actually knew. I mean, our greatest fears at that time were the environment, what the damage it was doing to our environment, our trees. And the two other major things, we were very concerned about the EMFs, electromagnetic fields, so close to our houses. I mean,
Absolutely.
on our street, bedrooms are less than 20 feet from the wires.
Yes, I know.
So it was the closeness of it. It's not necessarily that the voltage is so, it's very high for how close it is. And then our other issue was the smell that was emanating from the poles. It was a horrible stench, and we really didn't know anything about it. And what ended up happening was, after researching and finding out more about it, the pentachlorophenol, which is the chemical, has ended up being such a major, major issue that it's evolved into so much more. And it's almost a year now since the poles were put up, which is in itself amazing that it's been a year. The chemical pentachlorophenol, by May 2015, if all goes according to plan, will be banned internationally, except in the United States, who is not a party to the international treaty, because of a lot of political lobbyist maneuvering. But it should be, because it's a carcinogen. It's terrible for children. It's terrible for all human beings. It's terrible for animals. It's terrible for our environment. So the fact that it's still sitting in front of our houses is a disgrace. And thank God, Thiel and Laval, our state assemblymen and senators, have brought forward a resolution to ban pentachlorophenol in New York State. So that's one very good thing that's happening. And I hope it passes the New York State legislature, because that would be a major pressure on the EPA if that did happen. And the other thing is, that's amazing about New York State, where there has been nothing said by our governor, and any state agency has intervened, is that they've put a wonderful ban on fracking in New York State. And the New York State Department of Health, which has said there's nothing wrong with the pentachlorophenol, and so has the New York State DEC, even though we are way, like 300 times over the New York State DEC standards for pentachlorophenol in our ground, in our soil, and 48 times the level of toxins in our groundwater. They have said there is no problem. They have all said that fracking is terrible. Zucker, the head of the DOH, has said he wouldn't let his children live near fracking. But fracking, as they say, there is no real evidence yet. They believe there will be evidence, there's potential for evidence, so for that reason they're banning it. But pentachlorophenol, which there are reams of evidence, they are just ignoring it. And I don't understand how these same state officials can talk out of both sides of their mouths and let our children
You don't
live.
understand it. I do.
I don't. I don't.
It's
how can
called
they say-
corruption.
All right, corruption. But how can the governor stand there and act like fracking is terrible, which it is? I agree 1,000% with their position, and not say anything about pentachlorophenol with a straight face.
Well, here's also we have to understand, and this is something that a lot of people don't realize about Long Island. Long Island's source of water is under your feet.
Right.
It's the sole source aquifer. We are not Westchester County. We are not upstate New York, where there are places you can get your water from. We can only get our water from under our feet. And that's the way this island was formed as the glacier came down and made Long Island. And so whatever is in the soil will eventually go into the groundwater. There's
Right.
just no two ways about it.
Right.
I mean, it may take time. It could take 20 years,
Right.
but it will happen.
Well, what I didn't say is we had done our own testing of the soil in April and found these incredibly high levels of pentachlorophenol in our soil, and that was 300 times the acceptable levels. Not one agency responded. They all said it wasn't a problem. I don't know why we have standards if 300 times the standard isn't bad. We asked the town and the village to please test our groundwater in December. They did a separate test with a separate company, and they found there was no pentachlorophenol in the groundwater, but there were components of the penta formulation in the groundwater. And what that means is So there are toxins, there are contaminants in our groundwater in East Hampton. They're just, penta breaks down, there are contaminants of every chemical. And so there are contaminants in our groundwater. So saying that there's no pentachlorophenol in our groundwater, that's not quite true because we have contaminants in our groundwater. It was a very misleading statement that
Well,
was in
it's
our-
like saying that an apple doesn't break down in your digestive system and become many different things, but it does.
Right.
So that's what happens with a chemical. The
Right.
chemical is pentachlorophenol.
Right.
I hope I'm saying it right.
Yes,
Let's
you
call
are.
it penta because that's much easier.
Right.
And as it breaks down, its components are there. They are in the ground already, and they are very, very.
48 times the acceptable level.
Yes.
That's what they are in our groundwater now. And in terms of our soil, at the lower, deeper level, they've just gotten worse over time.
And they
nothing's
actually
being
did
done.
find also the breakdown of these chemicals in the sump pump of the emergency center. There was water that was
Yes.
lying there, and there was evidences of these chemicals from the breakdown of the
Yes.
main thing that they use, this which is used actually in the construction of these, of the poles. Is that how that gets in there? Because it's also at the bottom. We also saw around.
Well, we think because there's so much penta, we really believed, which they've denied, that they poured pentachlor. In addition to what the pole leaches, our expert believes there was so much penta that they poured it around the poles. They denied it. PSEG said that is not true. But our expert feels the amount of penta that was there, which was over 300 times the acceptable level, additional was poured on. They deny that. One of the other things is penta.
Well, you know what? I'm going to just interrupt you to say you have to be a fool not to see it on the bottom of some of these.
Right,
these
well, it
poles.
does leach. They had said it will leach 4 inches, but it leaches like 20 inches, and they do clean it up. And one of the things the town has asked is that they clean up at all poles. But what we say is, you can clean it up, but then it just keeps leaching. It's going to keep leaching every time it rains or snows. So cleaning it up is not solving the problem. You have to remove the poles.
Besides, you are not getting the residue of the chemical out of that soil.
Right,
I mean,
right,
what
you aren't.
do they not realize
And it's
that
in
we're
the
not
air.
dumb?
It's in the air. It's highly transportable. So the only solution is really to remove the poles. That is really the only solution. And PSEG again says we're not responsible because the EPA approves it. The EPA has now just started another review process of penta. However, this review process will probably take 5 years. That is not good enough. And in their review process, they again say that they do not need to do a residential review of penta because it is not likely to be near children, because they think it's only used in industrial areas on utility poles, and that basic assumption is totally wrong. It's sitting in front of our houses. So they're starting with a premise that's wrong. And unless we get that changed, then they're going to make the same decision again. So we're dealing with a very corrupt EPA, and we're dealing with a very corrupt wood lobby industry, and the public really needs to start speaking up. And this whole thing that just came out about Agent Orange, I don't know if you saw that article that just came out this past week. It was in Huffington Post about Agent Orange on the planes that transported people, and that they have now reversed what the VA has been saying, that they have found that Agent Orange white residue really could have affected soldiers years later. They could have dried. And Agent Orange also has the same breakdown that pentachlorophenol. They all have dioxins and furans as their breakdown. And that's
Good old
what's,
Dow Chemical.
right, and that's what's so dangerous. It's the dioxins and the furans, which are all banned. Those are major chemicals that are on the global elimination list already. That's a byproduct of pentachlorophenol.
Well, I work with a veteran of the Vietnam War who has now developed heart disease, and which is, they are just beginning to say, is a result of the Agent Orange,
Right.
which he experienced. I
Right.
used to see it coming out of the helicopter.
So why would we take the chance with our families when there are so many other alternatives? If the rest of the world can do without, why would we expose our children? I just, it's beyond anything that I can understand.
It is mind-boggling to know that this company, this foreign invader from New Jersey, good old
Right.
New Jersey, would come into this. And it was interesting when one of the meetings, he talked about, the head, Daley, talked about, well, if we dig up the streets and put the wires underneath, we're going to run into the sewer lines. And everybody in the audience laughed. Of course, there are no sewer lines, you know. I mean, they have no idea.
Right.
They have no idea of what they are doing.
Right.
They just,
And what the utility companies are doing all over the country. I speak to people all over, and also what PSEG is doing in New Jersey. It's really frightening. And also the meters that are smart meters, you know, that they're putting up in people's homes, how dangerous those actually are, and how that, you know, that gives PSEG complete control in your home. It's just very interesting. There's so much we don't know. And, you know, it's important to keep everybody out of your home. They have enough access to all your information. So I've gotten involved in something I never knew anything about, and it's been a very interesting year for me. But we're continuing to fight.
yes, and I suppose that's what we have to continue to do. It's like so many issues all around. You always
Right.
have to continue the fight.
Right, and we really need to get the federal government outside of the EPA involved. And that we haven't done, but that's something that we're working on now to try to get, you know, we've gotten our state officials involved. We need to get our federal officials involved now, and that's the next part of it.
And I'm going to clue you, I think I've told you this before, I know I've said it before, that the reason they wanted to bring this PSEG into Long Island is to increase development. They wanted to put more power lines so that they could have every bit of space developed with, you know, houses and stores and stores and stores and all that kind of stuff, because that brings money into the state treasury. And that's what Mr. Cuomo wants. He is not, you know, as I always say, Andrew is no Mario.
Right.
He simply does not see the big picture. There is nobody who is overseeing the utility in Long Island.
Right.
There is nobody who has any kind of ability to monitor what PSEG is doing. And that's really wrong.
Right.
We are very fortunate that Theo, who has been really the hero of this fight,
Yeah,
has really stood by us so wonderfully. And we got to get everybody on board doing that kind of thing.
Right, and we also need to follow through on the the Reform Electricity Act and Utility 2.0. Really, I'm trying to really learn a lot and follow up on what they're doing and become more active in that to see how that affects both the poles going underground and also making it so that we are all more active in terms of what's going on.
The one other thing I did want to also add is that in case people in this town don't realize, because a lot of people don't realize what's going on, we are the only developed nation that has poles overhead. Everybody else, all of Europe, all of the developed nations, the poles, the lines of electricity are buried, except the United States. Can you figure out why? It's because the power companies have so much power in this. Power companies have power, and they are able to get their way.
They make a lot of money putting up transmission lines.
And when the poles, and when
They fall.
we have hurricanes and the lines go down, they come from all over, And there's a lot of money, federal money that comes into disaster areas, and they get a lot of money that they can use to bring in, companies from Ohio, and then they make money.
I think each pole weighs between 1,500 and 2,000 pounds.
The big ones, these new ones, they are unbelievable. If you haven't been down to McGurk Street, I think you need to go and take a look at it. Or you can even just take a look at the emergency management building there on Cedar Street. However, it's not quite doesn't hit you in the face as much because it's a bigger building. It's when you go on a small street.
Right. In the wintertime when you don't have the foliage covering it up.
I mean,
is when it's its
it really shocks you. It
Right.
really shocks you. I know it did to me the first time I saw it. I was like, oh my God.
Right.
But, so your plans are to try to get the federal government somehow or other
Yes.
involved.
I'm actively trying to do that now. And I'm actively working with international communities to get people involved in the United States. We have to wake up people in the United States because the rest of the world is awake.
Yes.
And the health effects, people have to be aware of how bad they are. People just don't understand. And the big problem is also we cannot get the media to cover the subject. It is very hard to get the media to cover the subject. It's just not glamorous to them.
Well, I think the media has lost some of its power in the last few years with the advent of social media and people going back and forth. They just don't have quite the spunk they had at one
Right.
particular time.
And you've been great, but investigative reporting about this, there's some great investigative reporters could do such a great job on this.
Yes.
So,
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Rebecca, one more time, huh?
I know.
We got to keep this fight up.
we gotta have wings.